It may seem like a silly question given all we've heard. College drinking, when's it a problem? If it were this group of wholesome-looking individuals having a beer, we probably wouldn't be here and be concerned about it. Fortunately, we tend to look at this kind of drinking and these kinds of outcomes, and that's what makes drinking in college students a problem. But really, is it the drinking or is it the drunken behavior that we're concerned about? I've become concerned over the recent years that it's convinced that it's really the behavior in which people engage in when they're drinking that is particularly problematic, whether it be alcohol-related driving or aggression or hooking up and sexual behaviors, coerced and otherwise. So Ken Scher and my lab have been looking recently at 21st birthday celebrations. This is a time of a lot of drinking going on, and in fact, some individuals will drink more on their 21st birthday than in any other time in their life. So it represented a nice place to look at the potential relationship between alcohol and these other types of behavioral risk. So with 150 students, we did timeline follow back and structured interviews within 4 days of their 21st birthday celebration. So we recruited these individuals who were about to turn 21. We calculated their BAC following the standard Matthews and Miller formula based on number of standard drinks, drinking duration, weight, and gender. We also looked at 21 different behavioral risks, and we categorized them into 5 rationally derived categories to look at the effects of increasing intoxication on these risks. These graphs, I apologize, are a little difficult to read. On the y-axis is the probability of these behaviors occurring. On the x-axis is the estimated blood alcohol level. But what you can basically see here is that for things like disinhibited behaviors, dancing on tables, drunk dialing, things like that, you see an increase with increasing intoxication. Interpersonal and work problems as well, getting into fights or arguments, missing work the next day. You actually see some decreases in some behaviors like sex and illegal behaviors such as drug use. And we'll come back to some of these behaviors again. There's a variety of ways to study the effects of alcohol on behavioral risk. There's laboratory studies, which tend to be analog studies. Peter Giancola has looked a lot at the effects of alcohol and aggression. Steve Maisto and Mike Carey and others have looked at analog situations of the effects of alcohol on things like sexual intentions. And then a few years ago, Lee and Stahl did a nice sort of overview of self-report ways to look at the effects of alcohol. This was focused on sexual behaviors, but we've since applied it to a variety of behavioral risk. So you can have, let's see if I can get this cursor out of the way. Global association studies in which you're basically looking at how much do you drink and how much do you do all these other difficult, bad things, and then you correlate the two. Or situational assessments in which you look at the frequency of engaging in these behaviors at the same time that you're drinking. Or event-level studies in which you look at a discrete event, oftentimes first sex, most recent sex, something like that. Lynn Cooper has done some work on that. And then look at the extent to which alcohol was used. A few years ago, Will Corbin and I did a study on the same sample of individuals looking at these behaviors using these 3 different methodologies. So among 576 college students, we looked at their alcohol use, their sexual behavior. We looked at sex-related alcohol expectancies and a variety of other measures. And here's, in a nutshell, our findings. At the global level, when you controlled for sexual frequency, which is important to do, we found no associations between alcohol use and condom use. At the situational level, when you looked at sex with a new partner, it was more likely to involve both alcohol use and condom use. And we found that higher perceptions of risk associated with a new partner led to greater condom use if you were intoxicated. These findings are a little complex, so Will's here, and I'm sure he can flesh out the details for you if you have any questions. At the event level, we had 197 participants who provided data on 2 sexual events, the first sexual event with their current partner and their most recent sexual event with their current partner. We used regression analysis controlling for gender, duration of relationship, and oral contraception, which we thought might have an effect on whether or not one used condoms. Here's what we found at the event level. For first sex, drinking led to reduced likelihood of condom use for those with strong positive alcohol-related expectancies. For more recent sex, again, same partner, neither alcohol use nor expectancies were associated with condom use. In fact, oral contraception accounted for a huge percent of the variance in that behavior. There's a number of advantages of looking at event-level analyses, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my time. These are some of the benefits. First of all, it allows you to make temporal relation conclusions about alcohol and behavioral risk. It's also possible to examine alcohol use in conjunction with other contextual factors like relationship characteristics that Will and I looked at or gender differences. But perhaps most importantly, you can examine within-person effects of alcohol and behavioral risk so you can determine whether a given individual's increasing blood alcohol level is more likely to lead to these behavioral risks. The data I'll be talking about are taken from the UT Experience, which was a longitudinal study that was designed to study alcohol use, negative consequences, and behavioral risk from high school through college, and we've actually been fortunate to go beyond college. We recruited students from the fall 2004 incoming class at the University of Texas at Austin. We had several conditions. I'm focused on the longitudinal piece here. 2,245 students were randomly assigned to complete semi-annual surveys, years 1 through 3, and an annual survey once in their senior year. We used web-based surveys and daily monitoring. Like some of the other studies, like John was talking about, a wide number of measures, but just to give you an idea, we focused on alcohol use measures using both objective and subjective measures, which Ken Scher has pointed out the utility in looking at both, and I'll show you later why we think that's very important. Consequences of alcohol use, so we looked at social, emotional, physical, disciplinary, a wide variety of different kinds of consequences. And then a range of behavioral risks, sex, both safer and unsafe, aggression, sexual coercion, drug use, property crime, etc. So looking at the daily monitoring to study event-level associations in the UTE, these longitudinal participants monitored their daily alcohol use and behavioral risk for 30 days once each year. New groups were randomly assigned each week so we could look across the school year. They were paid $1 a day to do this with a bonus if they logged in on 30 consecutive days. And we got reasonably nice compliance. I'm going to focus first on some data in year 1. Actually, this was just from September to May through the academic year, not covering summer. We had over 1,600 individuals monitored during this period, with 84% providing 14 or more days. So we focused on them. And we also wanted to look at those individuals who reported drinking. So that was about 58%. For a total of a little over 1,100 participants and about 30,000 days of monitoring. We calculated several different variables from this. We got average blood alcohol levels, so that was over the course of 30 days, what was the average BAC that individuals reached. A daily estimated BAC, which is how drunk did they get on that given day. And then the behavioral risk that occurred on average and on that given day. So the average measure answers the question, or is designed to answer the question, do heavier drinkers engage in more behavioral risk? The daily measure is intended to tell us, does deviation from your average BAC increase the likelihood of behavioral risk? And then you can look at the average by daily interaction, which tells you whether average BAC moderates the effects of daily EBAC on the likelihood of behavioral risk. So in other words, there's somebody like a light drinker who drinks more than average at greater risk than a heavy drinker who drinks more than average. Dan Neal and I published this a few years ago in JCCP, and in a nutshell, this is what we found. We found only average EBAC effects for drug use, driving after drinking, and sexual activities and gambling. We found both average and daily BAC effects for unsafe sex and aggression. So this is telling us that heavy drinkers engage in more aggression and have more unsafe sex. It's also telling you that as your blood alcohol level deviates from your norm on a given day, you're more likely to engage in these behaviors. This is aggression graphed here. You'll see that the heavy drinkers are always higher than the lighter drinkers. That's that average BAC effect. And you can see as blood alcohol level, I said I wouldn't use this thing. It always makes me look nervous. Because Lord knows I'm not. As BAC increases, you see that aggression goes up. And yes, that is the women on top. And we've found this in just about every study that we've done, that alcohol brings out the aggression more in women than in men. The daily monitoring, the really cool stuff, average by daily BAC for property crime, sexual victimization, and perpetration of sexual aggression. So what that tells you is, yes, most dramatic over here is for the light drinking men. Those who deviate from their norm, who drink more than they ordinarily do, are at much greater risk for perpetrating sexual aggression. So the summary of those cross-sectional event-level associations is that heavy drinkers are more likely to use drugs, drive after drinking, gamble, and have sex. Deviating from your average levels of intoxication, you're more likely to have unsafe sex and act aggressively. Then deviation from one's average alcohol use puts lighter drinkers at greater risk for property crimes and sexual coercion. So this begs the question, why might drinking contribute to behavioral risk? Abby says I do it better when I'm drunk. And Mark Goldman spoke to us a lot about how alcohol outcome expectancies may contribute to these behavioral risks. And I've done a bit of that research myself. Other possible explanations, alcohol myopia or attention allocation, suggesting that alcohol impairs your cognitive processing ability, in particular, making you more in tune to process cues that promote risk-taking behavior. We've done a series of studies in my laboratory showing that alcohol intoxication reduces your perception of risk around these activities, therefore perhaps making you more likely to engage in them. And I should say at the outset, I don't consider any of these to be mutually exclusive. I think a comprehensive model would probably include all of these. What I want to raise today that not as many people have looked at is the idea that subjective intoxication may be contributing to these behavioral risks. And I'll pose the question, is it how drunk you are or how drunk you feel? So the first effort to look at this was looking at drinking and subjective intoxication as predictors of negative outcomes. We took this from that 21st birthday study I told you about earlier, so the same 150 people using the timeline follow back, structured interview, and questionnaires. We looked at, Reagan Witherall and I published this in 2009, we looked at final estimated BAC, again estimating it based on those same factors I told you earlier, and a variety of negative consequences. Subjective intoxication was measured at the midpoint of the 21st birthday drinking celebration. And we rated both how stimulated and how sedated you felt. This was using the BAES, the Biphasic Alcohol Effects Questionnaire, which has 7 items each for stimulation and sedation. We looked at direct and mediated effects of subjective intoxication on drinking outcomes, controlling for blood alcohol level. So this is how drunk you feel, controlling for how drunk you are based on your blood alcohol concentration. So I'm going to just focus for sake of time on blackouts. We looked at some different outcomes, but blackouts. This is showing you the analyses looking at the direct effects. So what you see is that how stimulated you felt at the midpoint of your drinking event had a direct effect on whether or not you had blackouts. It had a direct effect on what your final BAC was you reached. And of course, your final BAC had an effect on whether or not you experienced blackouts. When we did the mediational analysis to see whether blood alcohol level accounted for these effects of stimulation, you see that it does not. There is still an effect for how high you felt on whether or not you had blackouts, controlling for the amount that you consumed. Same was the case here with sedative effects. You see a direct effect of sedative effects on blackouts. There was not an effect of how sedated you felt at the midpoint on your final BAC, although your final BAC did predict blackouts. And then putting everything into the model, we again find that there's this direct effect of how sedated you felt on whether or not you experienced a blackout. So these subjective perceptions seem to be pretty important. It led to the most recent analysis that Patrick Quinn completed hours, days, I guess at this point ago. And so I'll end my time talking about these. This was, again, based on the UT experience. This was, however, our longitudinal data. What I presented to you that Dan Neal and I had done was just the year 1 cross-sectional. So this is taking into account 4 years of daily self-monitoring over 1,800 participants, over close to 150,000 total observations. Try analyzing those data. That's why Patrick's here. And our predictors, we calculated both daily and average, similar to what I was telling you before. Subjective intoxication, this time measured on a 0 to 100 scale, from not at all drunk to extremely drunk. We did not distinguish in our monitoring data between stimulated and sedated effects, unfortunately. And we also calculated EBAC in the same way I mentioned earlier. Our outcomes, we had several. We looked at any negative consequences. So again, this could be financial, disciplinary, social, etc. And again, we looked at our variety of behavioral risk. This is a busy table, I realize that. I'll call your attention to just a few things. On our estimated BAC per drinking day across years 1 through 4, as you can see, is approximately 0.08 is how drunk they got on the days that they drank. Subjective intoxication on drinking days was about an average of 25. Remember, that was a scale of 0 to 100. Not really going to address the issue of tolerance today, but it's an important issue, and as you'll see, that does decrease across the 4 years, even though blood alcohol levels are increasing. Prevalence of the outcome data, again, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but for negative consequences, you can see that anywhere from 26 to 31% across the 4 years was the prevalence for those consequences. You see wide variability in the prevalence of the risk behaviors from vandalism down here, which was quite low. It started out at a 4% prevalence rate in the freshman year of college, and it dropped to about 2.5 by senior year. Sex is by far the most prevalent behavior, and most of the behaviors peak around junior year. So what did we find? With respect to negative consequences, looking at subjective intoxication and estimated blood alcohol level, in all of these analyses, for the results I'm telling you about subjective intoxication, we controlled for BAC. When I tell you the effects of BAC, we controlled for subjective intoxication. So in this case, subjective intoxication controlling for blood alcohol level, we find, for example, a 10-point increase in your daily subjective intoxication ratings was associated with a 24% greater odds of experiencing a negative consequence. On the other hand, individuals now at the average level, that was at the daily level, participants who report a greater subjective intoxication on average were just generally more likely to experience negative consequences. Now looking at blood alcohol level, controlling for subjective intoxication, you find that a 0.01 increase in daily blood alcohol concentration was associated with a 4% increase in the odds of experiencing a consequence. We found no effect of average BAC on the experience of negative consequences, controlling for subjective intoxication. This is those data represented graphically, and as you can see, so we have the probability of experiencing a consequence based on increasing blood alcohol levels and as a function of increases in subjective intoxication. And what you can see from the slopes, it looks like subjective intoxication is exerting a stronger influence on negative consequences than is your blood alcohol level. Looking next at behavioral risk, again as a function of subjective intoxication and blood alcohol concentration. Subjective intoxication, controlling for your BAC, you see a 10-point increase in daily subjective intoxication associated with an 8% greater odds of both drug use and unsafe sex. Participants with greater subjective intoxication, on average, were more likely to use illicit drugs, have sex, have unsafe sex, and act aggressively. Looking then at blood alcohol levels, controlling for subjective intoxication, a 0.01 increase in your daily EBAC was associated with a 2% greater odds of aggression, and check this out, a 1% lower odds of any sexual behavior. Heavier drinkers, so those individuals with higher average blood alcohol levels, were more likely to gamble. An interesting subjective intoxication by EBAC interaction at the daily level. The associations between daily subjective intoxication, sex, aggression, and vandalism were stronger at higher BACs. So here this is graphed out, and you can see that the solid lines are the higher subjective intoxication, the dotted lines the lower subjective intoxication. So here's that effect for sex. The drunker you are and the drunker you feel, the less likely you are to have sex. Whereas for aggression and for vandalism, the drunker you feel at higher blood alcohol levels, the more likely you are to engage in these behaviors. So in summary, looking at this within-person effect of daily subjective intoxication, an individual is more likely to experience negative consequences, to use illicit drugs, and to have unprotected sex at higher levels of subjective intoxication, controlling for their blood alcohol level. Looking at the average, the between subjects effect, you see that students with greater average subjective intoxication, controlling for their average blood alcohol level, are more likely to experience negative consequences, have sex, have unprotected sex, use illicit drugs, and act aggressively. And then we saw that interesting interaction at the daily within-person level between subjective intoxication and blood alcohol concentration, whereas an individual is more likely to have sex, act aggressively, and vandalize at higher blood alcohol levels when they feel drunker. So the question is, what's more important, how drunk you are or how drunk you feel? And the answer is it depends. It depends on the behaviors you're looking at. Negative consequences, illicit drug use, and unsafe sex are more strongly influenced by how drunk you feel. Whereas sex, aggression, and vandalism are influenced by both how drunk you feel and how drunk you are. So the implications of this, future directions, I think it's very important to continue to do event level and laboratory-based studies for understanding the effects of alcohol on these other behaviors. I think it's critical to include both objective measures, as we typically do, blood alcohol concentration, estimating, or breathalyzer if we can, but not to lose sight of this subjective intoxication as an important measure. And I think they could both be potentially important targets for intervention or prevention programs. I think it's also important to examine individual differences and changes in subjective intoxication over time. I sort of teased you with that graph, but we do see this tolerance effect over time. So whereas college students are continuing to drink more, as we've heard, up to a certain point, they are developing tolerance and they are feeling less drunk, which will have some implications for their behavior. I think that's it. I want to thank everybody that's helped on this project. Will Corbin, who's here, Patrick Quinn, who's a rock star status graduate student. I hope you have a chance to meet him. And thank you.